Hey everyone, how's it going? I hope you're all doing great, as I always say, following the 3 H's of the channel and all that good stuff. And in this video, it's all about encounters that happen in the desert. So, if that sounds like something you're interested in, definitely pull up a stump with me and let's jump into it. Thank you for watching. I keep seeing people out in the desert. I've lived for half my life in the American Southwest. I've always been an avid hiker, spelunker, camper, shooter, and off-roader. That meaning I've spent the majority of my free time far away from civilization and in the remote government-owned wastes. One of the oddest reoccurring events that I've ever experienced is the spotting of other people. Not hikers or outdoorsmen, just random people dressed completely normally, usually no visible bag or water, and these are always like half a day or more away from the nearest structure of any kind. No car or even a place to park one in the entire vicinity. Does anyone have a reasonable explanation of what this is? This is usually at night, and most times I'm with somebody who saw them as well. And it's always by the side of the road while I'm driving at night, or most times it's at a too far distance for me to be able to communicate with them, but it's always in a place or a way that doesn't make any sense or can't make sense at all. There's no reason for them being there. I'm talking like a 2-day walk outside of the nearest city, and they have no bag, no car, and it's 2 a.m. The first time I saw one that I felt was beyond normal was about somewhere around 4 years ago. I was 10 miles away from anything on a desert road. All of this at about 2 a.m. in pitch darkness. I had a light bar with brights on. We had just passed the city limits, and were joking about a bunch of cars that were parked just outside the sign, and how many people were all probably young couples, getting it on. It was just a funny joke at the time. But we could clearly see them from their reflectors, and we also knew this part of the desert like the back of our hands. This was always the spot where, young new couples would always congregate. So, we keep driving. Once we're quite a ways past the warmth of the city, the temperature drops another 15 degrees. By this point, I was pretty much freezing my ass off in this open-top Jeep. And then, we see a figure just a couple paces off the road. He either wasn't moving or was moving very slowly on the road away from us. He was a tall, dark man, dressed in regular street clothes. He didn't react to our car as we passed, and he had no visible bag or anything. Before I could say anything about how I see this quite frequently, my friend asked me if I could see the demon. I rationalized that maybe his car was on the road up ahead, but we drove for another hour and didn't see any other vehicles. My friend then went on to tell me that these people that I see out in the desert are not people, they're demons, and that I should never follow them unless I want to end up dead. I have lived in southern Arizona my whole life. I've camped all over, and I've also had some weird things happen to me. Here was a more memorable one. I was on a camping trip up to the Four Corners and back. I stop for the night somewhere north of White Sands. I want to do some shooting in the morning, so I go in a ways from the state highway. It's 10 p.m. I can only see what's directly in range of my headlights. Everything else may as well not exist. It's pitch black. So I'm driving those narrow dirt roads and crisscrossing washes with the creosote scratch both sides of the truck. I'm probably 5 miles in or so, and there's a small clearing where two roads cross and allow you to turn around. And then there's some guy there. He's just walking in the opposite direction of the highway. He looks like he's just wearing khakis and a polo. He has no water, no flashlight, no bag of any kind, not even a fanny pack. He doesn't ask for a lift or even acknowledge my existence, not even looking at me. He just keeps walking. There could be some mundane explanation, but that far out, I don't know. It's really chilling. So I live in the southwestern US, and as you can imagine, alien, skinwalker, crawler, and everything else, rumors are everywhere. There's all manner of crazy stuff here. And well, here's what I saw. I was 15 at the time. I was in Boy Scouts. We were on some kind of camping trip. It was down deep in the desert. Honestly, the campground was terrible, but I needed the certifications at the time. So we were going on this hike, which ended up being more like a ruck march. So I was in the back. I was the designated straggler catcher. As such, I only have a walkie-talkie to communicate with the head of our little trip. And as you can imagine, here's where the fun happens. The sound comes on the walkie-talkie. I can only describe it as a buzzing of a bee combined with the sound of a squeaking engine belt. I call up to the scoutmaster to see if they're getting the same interference. They aren't. I take the battery out. I put it back in. The same sound persists. I switch through all the channels. They all have this same sound. Now, while I'm doing this, I don't realize it, but I'm starting to stray from the group, further and further away. I end up in this pit with rocks. I think it might have been an old quarry. I'm still hearing the same sound. It's getting really annoying. At this point, as you can imagine, I'm considerably spooked. I call out to see if anybody else knows what the hell's making that sound, but I realize that I'm all alone. There's no one around. There's nothing around. I start my way into the pit, and somewhere along the way, when I was looking at my walkie-talkie, instead of where I was walking, I hit my ankle on something, and I screw it up really bad. I roll down into the pit. I can't walk. The sky starts to turn dark. It's gonna rain. And in the desert, that means floods. And floods are bad, if you didn't know. I see this submarine hatch thing in the ground. I crawl over to it. I pop it open, and I fell in. At this point, I'm just fueled by the fear of death. I didn't quite realize what I had seen or what I was doing. I was just trying to get out of that little area. And then the hatch does something peculiar. It closes itself. I think there's no way that this is real. And then, as I'm looking around, I see all this old Cold War era stuff. It looks like a nuclear silo. I keep going. By this point, I'm able to stand. I just have to use the railings. I make my way to the crew quarters. Everything is as you'd expect it to be if it was the 1960s. It was as if the crew had just left everything one day and never came back. My ankle begins to feel, a little less painful. I'm able to walk a bit, more like hobble, but I'm trying. So I hobble down the halls.
I suddenly see something move at the corner of my eye. I call out for help. I follow it. And I know this is like one of those things that you don't do, but I was in pain and I was dumb. I end up somewhere near what I think was the launch duct. There's obviously no missiles or anything like that, but there's something down there. What I can best describe as bear pigs. Imagine a bear, but with massive tusks like a boar, and the weird skin they have in place of fur. I'm standing there, WTFing like all hell. I proceed to hobble and just try to get back as fast as I can, my way to the hatch. I get out. I'm just back in the pit. The weather's still awful. I still have to get out of here. I try to run, despite the pain. I work my way back to the trailhead. The group is looking for me. I get improvised stretchered back to the campsite. The first aid person splints my leg and asks me what happened. I tell them everything that's happened up until now. The scoutmaster comes over and says that I never called them on the walkie-talkie. I tell them I did, and they replied saying that they weren't getting any interference, but they maintained that they got no call from me on the walkie-talkie, nor did they get any interference. Not just that, the scoutmaster says I've been gone for over 3 hours and that the police have been called and were on their way. According to my watch, 30 minutes had passed, at most. I still have no idea what in the seven hells happened out there. Any ideas?
Me and my friends had a very weird encounter way out in the desert. And this isn't some schizo kind of skinwalker story either. This legitimately happened. All the backstory that you really need is that I'm a 24-year-old college dropout who currently works at a Wendy's. Most of my friends are graduated and are doing great things with their lives. I'll tell you that I'm not, but since I'm, talking about this, it's kind of redundant. So last year, 4 of my college friends and me decided to go camping out near Kingman, Arizona. Apparently, one of them had inherited some land in the mountains there and figured that we should go check it out. Considering that I had just lost my job and really had nothing better to do, I decided to tag along. The 4 who went were Francisco, who's a history geek, if you couldn't tell. He was a bit overweight in high school and now works out constantly, so he attracts a lot of female attention now. Terry, a computer science major, and I'll just leave it at that. There's not much more to that. Joshua is a guy who's into guns and hunting and military and stuff. And there's Will. He just kind of tags along. He doesn't really talk much unless you bring up animals, but he's pretty chill. Anyways, after meeting up at Josh's house in Vegas, we climbed into his ratty-ass 80s Isuzu Trooper and drove for what seemed like forever until we pulled off on this dirt road. At the end of the road was an old farmhouse with a little Geo Metro parked in front of it and a little chicken coop in the front. All of us were surprised that there would be neighbors this far out, and we talked to the man inside who had told him that Joshua's grandfather, the man who last owned the property, had made a deal with him to let him stay on the land as long as he wanted. Small talk continued for a bit, and eventually he decided that we needed to go and make camp somewhere. We chose the side of the hill on the opposite end of the lot from the house, which in reality was just a basically one-room shanty with a garage. But before we left, Francisco and Will had gotten to the chickens, which were currently playing in the yard, looking for worms and whatever else
birds do. Francisco had seen the big rooster picking on this little one, and he kicked the big rooster out of the way. Upon inspection, the little rooster was kind of deformed. He had a twisted beak. Francisco pulled out some of the sunflower seeds, and he fed the little thing, which it seemed grateful in a way. He was carefully pecking them out of his hand. Before we left, he stroked the chicken's head and walked off, leaving a small pile of seeds for the chicken that he had now named Polly, although the larger rooster immediately pushed him out of the way and ate them anyways. Setting up camp was fairly typical. A bit of shit-talking, some terribly offensive jokes, and joke arguments between Francisco and Josh. Things were pretty fun for a while. The first night wasn't even that weird. This is despite a few weird noises that we passed off as foxes. It was a fun night and a good start to what seemed like a fun trip. All this changed the next morning when we went outside and noticed weird claw marks in the sand all around our tents. Once again, we just blamed it on the foxes and carried on with our day. We were cooking some food and shooting cans that we had brought. I think Josh had brought a Ruger and Francisco had a Glock or something. I'm not into guns. I just know this because that's what their joke argument was about the day before. I remember him saying it was a 10mm, and again, I only know this because of the joke argument. The next night was quiet at first, until all of a sudden we heard a loud bang coming from the direction of the farmhouse, followed by squawking from all the chickens. This was followed by the old man in the house shouting, "You're not getting any more of them, you bastard," and a deafening gunshot that Josh said sounded like a 12 gauge. Deciding that he should probably care about what happens on his property, Josh insisted that the four of them go check the noise out. Yes, I know this is very much the horror movie white guy thing to do, but bear with me, it made sense at the time. We were thinking that some guy was trying to get in and kill the chickens or steal them or something. When we reached the house, we noticed a giant hole in the side of the pen, and all of the chickens had escaped. We could hear them squawking in the distance, and we headed in that direction. We also began to notice that there were chicken tracks in the ground as Josh's flashlight illuminated them. But what unnerved us was every 10 feet or so, there was a set of tracks that looked nearly identical to a chicken's, albeit much, much larger. After a few minutes, we caught up to the chickens, which were in a cluster, moving around anxiously. We were relieved that we found them, and we started looking around for the rancher, who was nowhere to be found. Josh and Will decided that they'd go back to the house and find him to see if he could help them get all the chickens back. Almost immediately after they left is when you can guess that shit hit the fan. As we sat in the darkness with only my phone flashlight and the light on Francisco's gun for illumination, we heard this sound that was almost like a pissed off rattlesnake and a cat or something in the distance. And then this dark figure jumped onto one of the chickens at the back of the group. It had spines down the length of its back. They swayed a bit back and forth as it landed. It also had disproportionately long back legs compared to the front. We both collectively crapped our pants, and Francisco told me to cover my ears because he was going to fire a warning shot to try and scare it off. Even with my ears covered, it still rang from the sound of him shooting in the air. To no effect, I might add, because this thing seemed unafraid and simply turned around with a chicken in its hands and looked at us. Unfortunately for this thing, Francisco saw that the chicken it was holding had a slightly deformed beak and was much smaller than all the others. It was at this point that I heard him dump 15 rounds of 10mm into it, leaving it a mangled pile of what looked like tar and Chick-fil-A sauce in its place. It fell over, making the most horrific noise I've ever heard. Then it dropped the chicken and kind of hobbled out of sight in one movement. Francisco walked over to his little chicken friend and saw that he was already very much dead, seemingly drained of all blood, with 3 holes in its neck. Immediately after picking the chicken up, we both heard the same pissed-off rattlesnake sound as before, but now seemingly coming from every direction. Luckily, it was at this point that Josh and Will returned with the farmer, who said, "At least it only got that one." Francisco didn't look happy about that, but he didn't say a word. Will asked what we shot at and looked at the mix of fluids on the ground. We both responded that we really didn't know, but there was more than one. After describing exactly what we saw and exactly what happened, the rancher said that he's seen them before, but he's never actually hit one. Needless to say, we all just slept in the car that night. We argued in the morning whether or not to just leave. Pretty much everyone wanted to, except for Francisco, and I decided that I would stay with him, which convinced the others to do the same. We decided that if we were going to see those things again, we'd want to do it on our terms. Going back to the farmhouse, Francisco chased and caught the rooster that was hassling Polly. He made Rocky look like a joke with how easily he did it. He then proceeded to carry it out to where we were camped and tie it to a stake in the dirt. From there we stopped and just waited. And I'll stop here to clarify that where we hit the thing the night before was mostly the upper torso and one of the arms that were basically just eviscerated, hence why I was able to jump away. As the sun went down, we started to notice the sound of nature was slowly disappearing once again, and we began hearing the same noises that we had passed off as foxes until this point. They were circling our camp. After 20 minutes or so, one of them lunges toward the rooster. Josh hits its center of mass with its .22, sending it back into the shadows, screeching in pain. A few minutes later, another one tries the same, only to take a 10mm to the head and collapse instantly. We got a closer look at that point, but the chicken was still pretty far out, and immediately another one hopped on and grabbed the corpse. As we were all dumbfounded looking at the thing, the same sound coming from pretty much every direction started again. The 3 of us got into the Isuzu with earplugs. Francisco stayed outside with the chicken. At this point, shit really started to go wrong. 2 came at once, and Francisco got one in the leg, but they managed to drag away the chicken. I think they expected it to make us angry, but Francisco laughed and said, "Got you." The hissing continued from every side, and we started seeing black eyes glinting in the light from the fire just outside of our field of vision. One jumped towards Francisco, and it got hit by Josh. Immediately after, Francisco put 2 rounds into its center of mass, and it stopped screeching. Then another one came, and actually got to Francisco, who grabbed it by the leg and swung it into the side of the Isuzu. He did this head first. It clearly wasn't moving after that, but he put a bullet in its head just to be safe. The screeching subsided at that point except for one noticeably louder and deeper noise coming from directly in front of Francisco. What sounded like a rattlesnake was now a series of deep clicks that seemed to reverberate in all of our chests. It was at this point that Francisco changed to a new magazine, even though he had some left in the old one. The sound began circling us, faster and faster, kicking up dust as it did, effectively creating a smokescreen around the fire. Then it came for the first time, jumping directly into the fire, smothering it instantly. It had died down in the time since this began, and obviously nobody had the time to get more firewood. The headlights from the Isuzu were the only source of illumination at this point. We saw smaller figures come and drag off the dead body from the side of the car, but we didn't bother shooting at them, because it was obvious that they weren't a threat. We were all yelling at Francisco to get back in so we could leave. But then we saw the eyes, and I swear to you, 2 glinting red eyes, almost like fire turned to ice, and we all just froze, like we were going through sleep paralysis and we could only watch. It charged at Francisco, who dumped his entire mag into it, sending it back into the darkness, trailing a bit of the weird black goo that these things seem to have for blood. He changed back to his other mag, which at this point only had 5 rounds left, from how he tells the story anyways. It charged one more time, and he didn't shoot. This thing pushed him to the ground and tried to bite his neck. He shoved his arm into its mouth and put the barrel to its neck, and put the last bullets he had directly into it, which caused it to let go of him and roll over, convulsing and making the most horrible noises we'd had ever heard. He began going back to the car to grab more ammo. Then it started to try to stand up once again. Josh started the car as I pulled him inside, and against his wishes, we left, not even bothering to grab any of our camping gear or anything. I don't know how fast we were going, but it seemed like it was 100 the whole way home, but I think that was adrenaline. We took Francisco to a hospital. They asked what happened. We told them that it was a pit bull that had attacked him. He got a few stitches, and otherwise is mostly okay. Although, it's weird how much he smelled like death for a few days after, no matter how much he showered. None of us have gone back there yet. I don't know what Josh plans to do with the land, but as far as I know, the rancher guy is still staying there. We don't really talk about it a whole lot since it happened to us, but Francisco did make a little grave for Polly in his yard. So, what'd you think of those? Let me know which one was your favorite one down in the comments. Do you have one of your own? I have an email in the description below that you can send them to if you'd like to. In the description as well is a PayPal and a Patreon if that's something you'd be interested in doing. And if not, or if you don't want to, just watching the video, liking, subscribing. It's all great stuff too. And commenting. And yeah, with that, I think I will see you in the next one. So thank you for pulling up a stump. Thank you for watching. Have a good week.